Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
Welcome to Merryn Talks Money, the podcast in which people who know the markets explain the markets. I'm Merryn Somerset Webb. This week, we're looking at why Britain has stagnated. I don't think anyone's going to argue that Britain has not stagnated. It has definitely been stagnating. But what can we do to trigger or indeed to catalyze future growth to change where we are? My guest this week is Sam Bowman. Sam is the founding editor of the online magazine Works in Progress, now part of payment processing platform Stripe. He has been Director of Competition Policy at the International Center for Law and Economics and an Executive Director of the Adam Smith Institute. Now, we have specifically asked Sam on as a result of an essay that he co-authored called Foundations, Why Britain Has Stagnated. There we go, that word again, which looks at the main problems that are plaguing us, how we can fix them, whether it is possible to fix those problems. And of course, that is the defining task of our generation and indeed of this new government. So we are hoping that Sam will be able to diagnose the UK's problems and tell us how to fix them in a hurry. Welcome, Sam.
Thanks for having me.
Well, it's a great pleasure. You know, we spend a lot of time on this podcast worrying about productivity, worrying about infrastructure, worrying about housing, and in particular, of course, worrying about the miserable real wages in the UK, because we firmly believe on this podcast that money can indeed buy you happiness. Now, I just wanted to set the scene, which you do at the beginning of your essay, and I imagine that an awful lot of our listeners will have read this essay already. But for those that have not, you've got a wonderful, not necessarily diagnosis, but description of the problem at the beginning. So I'm just going to read a few bits of that so that our listeners can get a sense of what it is we're trying to talk about here. Okay, ready? Between 2024 and 2021, that's before Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the industrial price of energy in the UK tripled in nominal terms. We have significantly more expensive electricity than many similar economies. With almost identical population sizes, the UK has under 30 million homes. France has 37 million. And then there is this thing that I always find really interesting. We complain a lot about second homes in the UK, right? But only 800,000 British families have second homes. 3.4 million French families do. If the world was a better place, our coastline would be plastered, literally plastered with second homes, and everybody would have their own summer house. Back to electricity, per capita electricity generation in the UK is just 2/3 of what it is in France. Our electricity generation is closer to developing countries such as Brazil and South Africa, home of the regular blackouts. Britain's last nuclear power plant, and this is really important, and I want to talk about this a lot, Sam, because I'm a great fan of the idea of let's go all in on the nukes. Our last nuclear power plant was built between 1987 and 1995. The next one, Hinkley Point C, is between 4 and 6 times more costly per megawatt in capacity than South Korean nuclear plants. We've talked about that on this podcast before. It's ridiculous. Tram projects in the UK, 2.5 times more expensive than French projects on a per mile basis. Now, I know all about this because I live next to the tram line in Edinburgh. I have watched the cost of building that kind of infrastructure in the UK in real time. And by the way, trams to New Haven, if you are listening, please, for the love of God, come and pick up the rest of the rubbish. It's not finished yet. I'm going to stop there because if I keep reading through all these lists, I'm going to get myself terribly upset. So here we are. We have this problem. And as you say, they're not disconnected observations. They highlight our real problem, what you diagnose as our real problem. We can't build anything. So now I'm going to hand over to you. Is it really that simple? We can't build anything, and that's destroying our economy.
Yeah, I think it is that simple. We point to France as an example of a country that on first glance gets everything wrong. You know, we all know France has incredibly high taxes. It has incredibly high regulation to the point where there's a cliff edge. If you look at the size of French companies are lots with 49 employees. And then there's a huge collapse in the number of French companies that have 50 employees. Either because companies just are refusing to grow because so many regulations kick in at that point, or because they're effectively committing fraud and underreporting the number of employees they have, both of which are pretty bad. We know that the French public hates any attempt to liberalize its economy. There have been riots over raising the retirement age to 64. I mean, imagine if we were talking about raising the retirement age to 64 in the UK. So according to all those kinds of metrics that I think almost anybody would agree will hold back an economy, France should be doing incredibly badly. But actually, France is doing roughly as well as we are. By some measures, they're doing better than us. I think it's reasonable to say they're doing about as well as we are. And the reason we think that is that even though they get those things wrong, tax regulation, things like that, they get the basics right. So the footprint of Paris has tripled since the Second World War, whereas London has basically not grown at all. As you mentioned, they build many, many more homes. They have far more homes per person than we do with about the same population size. They build things like tramways much more cheaply than we do. They build much, much more high-speed rail much more cheaply than we do. And all of those things are related. There's, I think, a big misunderstanding or kind of gap in the UK between costs and what you actually get. So we always talk about, oh, well, we should build Hinkley Point C, which I agree with. We should build HS2, which I don't agree with. We should build Crossrail, but never really recognize that the very, very high costs of those projects mean that we really don't get to build more than one if we get that one at all. We should be in a situation where we're able to build things like Crossrail and other metros much more cheaply at the price that, for example, Madrid built its metro, which was less than a quarter of the price of Crossrail, so that we can have more of them. So when we talk about the cost of nuclear power, we're not just complaining that we have to pay high prices for it. We're complaining that we don't get enough of it. And so we don't have anything like the kind of energy abundance that we want. And all of this adds up to a massive shortfall in investment. So the real origin of writing this paper was a frustration in the run-up to and after the election that many commentators were kind of finally beginning to catch up with people like you, Merryn, people like me, who've been talking about the UK underinvesting for years. But the main conversation sort of thinks of investment as this sort of abstract number, as investment as measured by how many pounds we're putting into some account somewhere or spending, when really what we care about with investment is what we're getting out of it. How many nuclear power plants are we getting? How many miles of railway? How many miles of tram line? How many miles of road? How many houses are we getting? And so the fundamental point that we're making is that we underinvest, both in terms of costs are so high that it wouldn't be economic to put much more money in than we do. And for the money we do put in, we get much less out, the stuff that we really care about, than we should. And changing that is really in our hands. Very, very little of this is a technological problem. It's almost all a political problem. And yes, politics can be very difficult to fix, but politics should be eminently fixable. And the fundamental argument that we make is that the UK could be a much more prosperous country without any change in technology, without any real change in the constituency of the economy. We just need to make it much easier to build the things that we need.
Let's go back then and talk about the reasons why everything costs so much more here. I mean, again, as I say, watching the Edinburgh tram in real time and watching the costs go up and up and up and comparing the cost per mile to tram projects elsewhere was a genuine shocker. Genuine shocker. When you run through the list, what are the reasons why the costs are so high? What are the main ones?
The three big things that I would point to are, number one, the planning system. Some people have read the paper as just being about the planning system, which isn't true, but it's understandable that some people would interpret it that way, because the planning system that we have is a relic of the Attlee government. It's a relic of post-war socialism in the same way that the NHS is. And I think it's similarly dysfunctional, but dysfunctional in a much more invisible way. So after the Second World War, the Attlee government nationalized huge amounts of the economy, including the way we use land. And it went from a system where, even though local councils did have the power to stop people from building things on their land, they had to compensate you if they stopped you from building something. So they had an incentive not to just block everything. They could block things, but they would have to bear some of the cost of blocking. And that meant that pre the Second World War, we had a much more balanced system that allowed lots of things to be built. And the 1930s, I think, really should be famous for being the most impressive decade of house building that we have ever had, almost entirely private house building.
And nice houses too. Crucially, really nice houses.
Really nice house.
Anyone would want to live in a 30s house. They were lovely.
they're brilliant and much larger than houses that have been built after the Second World War. Very affordable, often with a lot of garden space. There, there was a huge shift in the British economy towards building nice, affordable family homes in the 1930s. It actually is one of the reasons that we were able to avoid the worst effects of the Great Depression, the global Great Depression, and one of the reasons that we were able to rearm to fight the Germans in the Second World War. It was really as important as that. And if we were building at the same rate today that we built in the 1930s, if you adjust for population, we'd be building more than 500,000 homes a year. I mean, we talk at the moment as if 300,000 homes a year is really ambitious. And, if we're really lucky, we might be able to get 300,000 homes a year. I mean, that's chicken feed compared to what we should be building and what we have been building as a proportion of the economy in the past. So shifting to the Attlee government, what I would argue is a socialist land use planning system was really disastrous. And you can see the number of houses being built by the private sector collapse after that happens. And what also happens is that where homes are built becomes much less driven by market signals and prices and much more driven by effectively central planning. And that's left us with a situation where we don't build enough houses every year, and the houses we do build are often not anywhere near where people actually want them to be built. And the consequence of that is that people can't move to where good jobs are. So housing is not just a problem of bills. It's not just a problem of us having to spend more of our money on rents and mortgages than we'd like to. It's also, and I would say much more importantly, a problem of what jobs people can do and where.
And one of the things you say about that, I just want to go back quickly, one of the things you say about that is a major problem in London being the lack of a middle income group. Only the very rich and the very poor who live in social housing can afford to live in London, which means that, if you're a young or quite young person, you should, under normal circumstances, be drawn to the city to enter productive work. You aren't.
Yeah, I mean, during the Industrial Revolution, towns of 10,000 people grew by more than 10 times in less than a century. I mean, some towns, some cities that we now think of as being great cities, like Sheffield, went from being almost nothing at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution to centers of world commerce and world industry by the end of the 19th century. We haven't had anything like that kind of ability to move around and to migrate internally according to economic changes and changes in economic reality. And I think that's one of the really big reasons that we have been held back in our ability to grow. And you're absolutely right. There are some places in London, inner London boroughs, that have 30 to 40% of the housing being assigned to social housing. And that means that a lot of the most valuable, most central housing stock is occupied by people who are often not in work at all. If they are in work, they're often in fairly low productivity jobs, and they're occupying homes that could be occupied by people who could be far more economically productive and grow and drive economic growth much more. The result, as you've mentioned, is this kind of missing middle where if you want to live in kind of inner London, by which I mean sort of zones 3, 2, and 1, you either have to be very rich or very poor. Nobody in the middle can really afford to live in central London because they can't get into social housing and they cannot afford private housing. I think that's a disaster. I think socially and economically that's a disaster. And what's so frustrating about it is that fixing that problem is really, really simple. London is one of the least dense major cities in Western Europe. The nicest parts of London, places like Bloomsbury, Belgravia, are the densest parts of London. Density doesn't have to mean towers in the park. Density can mean 6-story, 8-story Georgian, Edwardian terraces. And building more beautiful and livable housing like that would allow us to allow many, many millions more people to move into London, get better jobs, start more companies with each other, and I think produce huge amounts of extra output. And we're just not doing it. And I think fixing that would be a tremendously easy way to drive a lot of economic growth and to just get a lot of output. Just building those homes would be a lot of economic activity and a lot of economic output that we could have tomorrow. We could begin working on that tomorrow if we want.
But planning isn't just about houses. It's about transport and all the other infrastructure that we need. And there we have a major problem as well, don't we?
Absolutely. I mean, the example that I find most frustrating is this tunnel called the Lower Thames Crossing, which is being built, or at least being proposed to be built, under the Thames to link up Kent and Essex. And this would also link up England's two busiest seaports. So there's a very obvious economic need for this. Now, the planning application for this alone has run to 360,000 pages and cost £297 million, which for context is twice what it cost the Norwegians to actually build the world's longest tunnel.
Okay, well, now we need to repeat that. The planning documentation for the Lower Thames Crossing, which, as you've just said, is incredibly important, 360,000 pages, going on 300 million so far. I'm going to repeat this because it's so important. That is more than twice as much as it cost Norway to actually build the longest road tunnel in the world. We have spent more on planning, double as much on planning alone than Norway has spent on building something similar. I mean, that is off the scale shocking, isn't it?
It's astonishing. And it's one of those figures that you have to read it and you have to check it. I encourage people who are sort of rolling their eyes in disbelief, check the sources, please, because it's so unbelievable and far-fetched that it feels like no reasonable person could possibly have allowed the system to get this way. But it isn't just planning in the case of infrastructure. It isn't just planning in the case of housing either, but it's primarily planning for housing. There are environmental assessments that slow down projects enormously, cost huge amounts of money. To reopen a 3-mile train track between Bristol and Portishead, there was an 18,000-page environmental assessment that cost £32 million. And to put that into context, the Jubilee Line extension in the early 1990s had a 400-page environmental assessment. So this is a recent phenomenon. This is a new development that we are requiring environmental assessments like this and of this cost and of this time. And it's one of the really, really major reasons. We have other some people would call them checks. I would call them huge roadblocks to building things. Something called the Aarhus Convention, which is an international convention that the UK is a signatory to, which caps the cost of legal challenges to infrastructure projects. So if you are even if you lose, so if you are a vexatious claimant, you don't want a tunnel being built near you, you can sue or you can judicially review the project. And even if you lose, the costs that you will have to pay to cover the winner's costs are capped at between £5,000 and £10,000. So trivial amounts of money. And this is something that we have made stricter in the last 7 or 8 years. The Theresa May government actually made this stricter, unbelievably. And what we've created is a situation where legal challenges to infrastructure are very easy and very cheap. There are huge numbers of triggers for judicial reviews. There's huge compliance cost with the planning system and the environmental assessment system. And then on top of all of that, the way that we pay for major infrastructure projects in the UK has moved from being something that was devolved and was either done by a private company, as in the case of most of our railroads, or by local authority, as in the case of many roads and tramways during the era of the tram, to a situation where national government pays for things and oversees major projects. And almost nobody in that project has an incentive to keep costs down. And I think this is the real problem that HS2 had, where basically nobody in the decision-making pipeline had any incentive to keep costs down for HS2. And that includes the cost of appeasing objectors. I think there probably does need to be some appeasement of NIMBYs in some cases for political reasons, but there has to be a counterweight to that says if you appease these people too much, and if you spend billions of pounds on unnecessarily tunneling loads and loads of miles of this line, a quarter of HS2 is supposed to be tunneled to basically avoid NIMBY complaints, then you're going to go bankrupt. Or the project is not going to happen, or you will get fired, or your voters will vote you out. And we have very few of those mechanisms in place now for these projects. The only real mechanism that we have is the Treasury coming in and saying, okay, you know what, actually, you spent too much money on this. We're cancelling this, or we're going to cancel some of this, which is a very blunt tool.
Well, also cancelling isn't helpful. That's not the correct incentive. Spend too much and we just won't do it. Not helpful.
Absolutely. We don't want a situation where the only two options are extremely expensive infrastructure or cancelled infrastructure. We want there to be incentives. And anybody who's worked for on any kind of complex project knows you need people at every step of the decision-making chain to be worried about costs. There's always going to be cost inflation, and you need people with strong incentives to keep the costs down, to make decisions that say, this isn't going to be the fastest high-speed rail line in the world. This is going to be the second fastest or the fifth fastest. It's going to be a lot better than what we've got, but it's going to be it's not going to be gold plated. And unfortunately, we just don't do that. So all of the problems that we have with environmental assessments and with planning and judicial reviews and stuff like that are compounded by the fact that the incentives for the people who are actually running the project don't factor costs in at all, really. And I think that's the kind of underlying reason that cost disease has grown so badly in infrastructure and things like nuclear power as well, but infrastructure especially. And again, we can change that. We can devolve decision making to people who are more accountable for the decisions they make and who can go bankrupt. And we can bring a more involved role for the private sector that includes loss as well as profit. I think a huge problem that we've got is when we do these sort of quasi-private projects, there is still the kind of government funder of last resort that insulates the private sector from its cost increases. And we can change that, but it will be challenging, and it's not straightforward to get there from where we are.
Let's go back to nuclear energy that you just mentioned. I mean, one of the really horrifying things happening in the UK at the moment and over the last decade is this extremely fast rise in the cost of electricity. And that's just a destroyer of industry, isn't it? Given that, like economic activity is energy transformed one way or another, the higher you make the price of energy, the less likely you are to get very much out of the other end. Now, we're supposed to be living in a world, we keep being told we're living in a world where a huge investment into the renewables industry will make our electricity cheaper and cheaper and everything's going to be absolutely marvelous. That's not happening.
Yeah, I have to say, I actually went into this paper feeling much more optimistic about intermittent renewables, wind and solar, than I do now. And in the process of research and writing and speaking to people who are working in this sector, I have come away with the sense that really we are doomed if we think that wind and solar are going to save us. And I think part of this is because solar does seem very promising in some parts of the world. The cost of photovoltaic solar cells is collapsing. We're getting to a point where solar cells, they're not going to be quite free, but they're going to be something approximating free. The problem is that you also need storage. In a place like the UK, where we get very, very overcast weather, as everybody knows, possibly people listening to this right now are listening to it in a very overcast November. This is the time of the year where solar is really not very good. But in the southwest of the United States, in Spain, in North Africa, solar may be very, very promising. The trouble is, it's just not going to work here. It may have some role to play, but we just cannot expect the baseload energy that we need, the baseload electricity production that we need to come from solar. And wind is just not seeing anything like the kind of cost reductions that solar is seeing.
Well, you talked about there being a system-level cost that people don't really think of, and there are all things actually that we've talked about on this pod before. The need for transmission lines to connect generation to households and industry, and that in the old days you had a few large power stations, and the transmission network simply connected those large power stations to the communities where the power was needed. But now if you have the power being developed in loads and loads of remote places all over the country, you have a very, very different setup. And there's that cost. And then there's the costs of the grid balancing, where you have to match up this intermittent energy with the needs. And then, of course, there's the costs of backup capacity. These are the three things that you list. And all these things are not necessarily always included when we look at the cost of renewals. And if you do include them, you get a slightly different picture. Is that fair?
Hugely, yeah, and completely. And I think the mistake that some people make is looking at wholesale costs, which are only about 30% of final bills, incidentally. Wholesale costs are really a significant but not overwhelming fraction of what we pay for when we pay for electricity. The rest is these kinds of system level costs. And what we're doing with renewables, and really with nuclear as well, is moving from a world where marginal wholesale costs are the most important thing to worry about, which is the case with gas, which is the case with coal, which is the case with oil, to a world where fixed costs are the things that we really care about. The marginal cost of a wind turbine is very low. Totally agree. But the fixed cost of a wind turbine, once you include all of the system level costs you're talking about, is quite high. And once you include the need to produce electricity when the wind isn't blowing and produce electricity and transport electricity from where the wind turbine is to where people actually need it, then the costs become quite significant. And I think that's the way that we make sense of this apparent paradox where we've been moving from a world where where we've been building lots and lots of renewables, which, do indeed have very, very low wholesale costs when they're producing energy. But we have to pay for them to have been set up in the first place. We have talked about the environmental levies, things like the renewables obligation, contracts for difference. These are the contracts and subsidies that are explicit that we have set up to support renewables, and they are important. They now exceed £10 billion a year, but they're not anywhere near the whole story. And even if we weren't on the hook for those, the cost of renewables, I think, would still be prohibitive. At the beginning of November, the energy mix for the first week was majority gas. And this is in a context where we've already built more than wind and solar for more than a decade. We are supposed to be able to move to a decarbonized electricity grid, or the government's aim is to move to a decarbonized electricity grid by the end of the decade. I just do not believe that is possible with wind and solar. And if I'm wrong, please, I very much hope I'm wrong. But I just don't think that that's going to happen. The thing that we point to, and the event that we point to that is a model that we may be able to follow, is France's nuclear rollout in the 1970s and the 1980s, which was state-led. It probably wasn't the way I would have favored it at the time, and I would hope that we could do a non-state-led version of it, but managed to decarbonize the French economy far, far earlier than, or decarbonize the French electricity grid at least, far, far earlier than any other Western European country, and did so without really having decarbonization in mind. And now that the rest of Western Europe is I think trying to decarbonize the wrong way with intermittent renewables rather than nuclear, France has become quite an important energy exporter. We are quite reliant on French nuclear energy when the wind isn't blowing and when the sun isn't shining. I think that it would be a mistake to continue that state of affairs. And I think nuclear is a clean form of electricity that we should be looking to. The problem is that it's so expensive. The problem is that we are building nuclear power plants for vastly more than even wind and solar cost us. And that has to change.
It doesn't have to be that expensive, does it? I mean, one of the numbers that I keep pulling out is that I saw somewhere, and you can tell me if this is correct or not, that we made 7,000 design adjustments to the Hinkley plant against the design that I think worked perfectly well in France. And each one of those adjustments comes with cost.
Absolutely. I mean, my favorite cost is the underwater megaphone to scare away fish from the kind of cooling system. The reactor at Hinkley Point C needs to draw in seawater to cool itself down. And some fish would be killed in the process, not in any way that would be dangerous to the reactor, but just some fish would be, I think, sucked into a grid and killed. And some of these fish, a few hundred of these fish would be from rare and protected species. And so the reactor, the EDF, was instructed to come up with a way to stop these fish from being sucked in. Their solution was to build an underwater megaphone that would play loud noises that would scare fish away. And amazingly, doing this will actually increase the risk to human life of the reactor, because the megaphone has to be maintained by divers who undertake some risk in doing this. So in order to protect fish, we have not just increased the cost to the project, we've actually increased the danger to human life. And again, this is really for a few hundred fish of this protected nature. Do we know
what that costs per fish in terms of protection?
I don't know off the top of my head what that costs. I'm not sure the number is actually public for how much this particular adjustment costs. So I'm not sure if we do know.
If anyone knows the value that the UK state places on the life of every fish, please do write in and let us know.
But it is really extraordinary. If you look at what we built nuclear for in the 80s and as late as the 1990s, we built Sizewell B for about less than half the price that we're building Hinkley Point C for, and about 2/3 of the price that we are estimated to build Sizewell C, although I will confidently predict that Sizewell C will increase in costs once we start building it for the reasons that we're talking about. That there is no final decision on a project like nuclear. You keep having to go back. You keep having to make adjustments. You keep having to do compliance and kind of this dance with the regulator and with the environmental regulator. And it means that costs just drive up and up and up and up. Now, we know both from history and from international examples that it doesn't have to be this way. South Korea builds nuclear reactors for about a quarter of the price that we build them in South Korea, and it has committed to building new reactors in the Czech Republic for about half the price that we're building. So a very simple solution would be to contract with the South Korean Energy Authority, KEPCO, to do this for us. I think a more exciting approach, I think we should probably do that. I think a more exciting approach would actually just fixing our regulation to rebuild the UK nuclear industry, which could be world leading. There's no reason that we should have to resort to South Korea to build our nuclear reactors. We have built many, many good nuclear reactors. We built the world's first nuclear reactor, and by as late as the 1960s, we had more nuclear reactors than the rest of the world put together. Or, in existence in Sheffield is a company that builds some of the, effectively a world-leading nuclear reactor casing company that's still operating, still exporting. It's a company that not many people know about, but is something that I think we should be quite proud of. We should be reviving that kind of industry by making it much easier to build, making it much more certain to build, and ultimately making it much cheaper to build. And it will have the double benefit of, yes, we'll be able to revive the nuclear industry. Yes, we'll be able to build the low carbon energy that we need for an actually affordable price. And actually a triple benefit is that in getting much cheaper electricity, other English industry, British industry, will be able to come back. So we know that industry is incredibly sensitive to the price of electricity. It's obvious that it will be. And as we decarbonize, we're going to get more and more dependent on the price of electricity being low to have industry. Now, I think it's quite important that we do that. And I think that whatever discussions or debates people want to have about industrial policy, and that's great, but the best industrial policy in the world is not going to work for you if you don't have electricity costs that are competitive with South Korea, competitive with China, competitive with India. And right now we are way, way, way above them.
Okay, let's talk about optimism. Should we try that?
Let's do it. I'm a very optimistic person.
And one of the things that you stress in your report, which I think is very valuable, is the value of the UK's institutions, our legal system, our parliamentary system, all these things that we have that are still reasonably solid, that we still believe in. And of course, we have our amazing financial industry. We have English, which we can't dismiss, and we have a great time zone. We have some wonderful advantages. We have a very solid base, right? So that still exists, not going anywhere. What's your feeling about fixing the rest? I mean, our most recent budget, flicking through it and looking at it, I'm not entirely sure that Rachel Reeves had read your essay quite as carefully as the rest of us.
Well, the reason that I am optimistic, I think there are two main reasons. One is that things really are getting very, very bad. Things really, every year that goes by that we don't see not just normal growth. I mean, we've had so much stagnation since the mid-2000s that we should be seeing quite rapid catch-up growth, both catching up with the US, the kind of economic frontier, and just catching up with the trend, catching up with what we looked like we should have been on for prior to the late mid-2000s. So every year that goes by that we experience stagnation, I think it becomes harder and harder to deny that we have a really, really big problem. And I think people do recognize, and the response to this paper, I think, shows that people really do recognize that the big problem is that we're just not building things. We're not allowing things to be built. The price of a house in London is very, very high. There is a huge amount of demand to live in somewhere like London, Oxford, Cambridge. It isn't that there isn't demand. If it was really cheap to live in London and we were still stagnating, then I'd be worried, because I would think that we may have nothing going for us. We may be trying to jumpstart an entire economy here. Really, we're just trying to meet demand that is already there. So that's one reason. I think people are becoming more and more aware of the problem. The second reason is that a lot of the time, the answer, I think, is giving more control at a much more local level and taking control away from national level quangos and national level kind of independent agencies that we've set up, I think, in quite a misguided way to try to kind of fix problems that, in my opinion, are not really the big problems that we've got. So I think that, for example, if local councils could make decisions about nuclear power permitting rather than the environmental agency, rather than the amount of involvement that the nuclear regulator has, we should be checking for safety. We should be checking to make sure that the nuclear reactor is safe, but we shouldn't be worried about whether the nuclear reactor is going to kill a few fish.
Or ruin someone's view.
Yeah. And the reason that we should be optimistic is that local councils should have a really strong incentive to allow things like that to be built in their areas because they bring jobs, they bring business rates, payments. There are all sorts of reasons that you should want these things to be built in your area. And historically, it was the case that you would want these things to be built in your area. It's a fairly recent phenomenon. It's a post-war phenomenon that local councils do not want prisons in their area. They don't want the kinds of infrastructure that the country wants because we do not allow them to retain the business rates that those projects used to pay. Fixing that, I think, should be quite easy. And once we fix that kind of incentive, and, I mentioned earlier, local councils used to have a really strong incentive to not block development because they would have to pay for it. I think that's the kind of mechanism we want to go back to, and we want to give them incentives to allow development. And I think once we do that, combined with devolving decision-making to that kind of level, we will fix a lot of the incentives problems that exist. I think it's quite striking that during the era of the tram in the UK, when we had the first major tramways in many cities, we had the first overhead tramway in Leeds, overhead powered tramway in Leeds. Many of these tramways were not run by private companies. They were run by the local authority for profit, and they were used by the local authority to generate money that they could then spend on other projects. I think we have a pretty good tradition here that local government can actually allow things to be built and build things themselves if we give them the right incentives to do so. So I'm quite optimistic about that. And I think kind of secondly, the other thing that we should be doing is giving Parliament much more power over national level projects that get built. Again, historically, when we built railways in the 19th century and right up until the Second World War, I believe, it wasn't an independent quango that made the decision about what got built. It would be a private operator would have a proposal. They would say, we want to build this railway from here to there. They would bring it to a select committee in Parliament. The select committee would make a decision. They would then pass a bill that would protect the project from, vexatious lawsuits and things like that. And it would get built. And you'd have a privately owned, operated, and managed railway. I think there's a lot of infrastructure that could be built by that kind of mechanism. It would bring power over these kinds of projects back to democratic decision makers, away from, I think, very, very badly incentivized kind of independent bureaucrats. And I think that's the kind of underlying change we need to the country that I think probably could happen. It certainly won't be easy, and it certainly will be quite a significant change in the way we do things, but it will be going back to the way we did things when things worked really well and when we built a lot of things in this country. So it's possible. I think there's a growing demand for it. And I think what's really optimistic about it is that it works with the grain of the history of British democracy rather than against it.
I agree with you. The only thing I'm concerned about is that I'm not sure that I'm seeing in this government an appetite for understanding that, appetite for decentralizing, an appetite for moving away from non-democratic quangos back to Parliament, an appetite for sending power back to councils. I don't see that. I'm fascinated to know that you do.
I don't see it in this government, I have to admit. I think that it may be that this government feels the need for growth such that it just does the kind of nuclear option of calling in projects, centrally approving them, and just making them happen. They've done this with a few renewables projects. I don't yet have a sense that they're going to do this for things like nuclear, but they might. I think that they have nailed their colors to the mast of growth so much that they need growth. Kind of politically, they are going to be kind of humiliated if they don't get growth. And fiscally, it's looking increasingly likely that the tax rises that were in the budget are not going to deliver the kinds of revenues that were expected or were hoped for, which means that they really, really need growth, both from a fiscal point of view and a political point of view. So, stranger things will have happened than a government like this realizing that it needs to be quite bold. I don't think they're going to do the huge constitutional changes that I would love. And, I think we have to wait for a future government to do that. But in the meantime, I could see this government just saying, look, we need houses to get built. We're going to upzone parts of London, or we're going to do the Cambridge extension to build an extra 250,000 homes in Cambridge, whatever it might be. I'm not super optimistic about that, but gravity is a powerful force, and it's not one that this government can buck.
Yeah. When we talk about productivity, which we've done quite a lot over the last half an hour or so, one of the things that we haven't talked about is the public sector. And again, it's not something that's been addressed by this government so far, although obviously we have hopes, not high hopes, but hopes that it will be addressed. Is there anything you didn't really write about this in this report, but is there anything you feel we can really do there? And one of the shocking things when you look at the numbers is productivity having literally barely budged in the public sector over a multi-decade period, despite the extraordinary technological gains the rest of us have made over that period. Can you see, I'm pulling here back to your optimism. What can you see happening there?
So the optimist in me says that the money that has been assigned to the NHS is going to be used to kind of grease the wheels of reform. If I'm optimistic, then that's what they're doing. I don't think we have any reason to think that that's what they're going to do, but maybe they will do that.
There's a fine line, Sam, between optimism and delusion.
Well, I'm not saying that is what's going to happen. I'm saying it's plausible that that's the plan. I think the alternative, much less optimistic reading, is that they're making the same mistake that the Liz Truss government made of doing the kind of fun bit first. In the Truss's case, it was tax cuts. In this government's case, it's spending money on public services and talking about, we'll do the supply side reforms later. Rather than, I think, taking the medicine of the supply side reforms, getting a bit of growth, getting some sign that they're working, and then rewarding yourself or rewarding your clients with more money or with tax cuts or whatever you want to do. That's my kind of pessimistic take on what they're going to do. I don't have a huge amount of insight into what they're planning, so I don't know what they're doing there. I think that public services do not seem as if they are a high priority for reform from this government. The thing that really worries me is that I think that Labour came into power thinking that the reason the Conservatives failed was that they didn't know how to use the civil service, quote unquote. This was a thing that I just kept hearing. The Tories say that they just don't know how to use the civil service. And we know how to use the civil service. And they went in, they seemingly didn't have particularly well-developed plans about what they actually wanted to do in government. And I think they expected that the civil service would tell them what they needed to do, which isn't really the civil service's job. The civil service can advise you on various parameters that you set for it, but they're not there to tell you, well, you must build 1.5 million homes and this is how you're going to do it. That's your job. That's why we elect a government. So I think the initial signs are that they don't seem to be aware of how much reform the civil service needs and public services more broadly. Quite the opposite. But it may be that their experience of this, and they have 5 years, so they've got quite a bit of time, sort of wakes them up to how much needs to change in terms of the British state. And again, would I bet on it? No, I probably wouldn't. I think the main reason to be optimistic about the UK economy over the next few years is that Labour may need to do supply-side reforms just to get growth. I don't think they're going to do very much on public services. They certainly don't seem to, at the moment, want to do a public service reform, except maybe in the NHS. But, like I say, 5 years is a long time, and it's hard to buck gravity. If they keep putting more money into public services, they keep giving pay rises to public sector workers, and they still aren't delivering improvements in service and in results, then they may have no choice but to demand reform and to do this. But I don't think I would put money on it.
Well, we'll worry about crowding out the private sector on another podcast, perhaps. But as we always say when we discuss these things, our favourite Adam Smith quote, there is a lot of ruin in a nation hopefully everything will be fine. Sam, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to this week's Merryn Talks Money. If you like our show, rate, review, and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. And keep sending questions or comments to merrynmoney@bloomberg.net. Remember, you may know more about some of these things than we do. Let us know. You can also follow me and John on Twitter or X. I'm at MerrynSW, and John is John_Stepek. This episode was hosted by me, Merryn Somerset Webb. It was produced by Sam Asadi, production support by Moses Andam, and special thanks to Sam Bowman.